The snow was already past her knees when Sarah heard the horse. She had stopped moving approximately 20 minutes before that, though she could not be entirely certain, because the cold had reached the part of her mind that measured time and had quietly dismantled it. She knew she was standing in the Valdenmoor Passage, the mountain corridor that connected the southern villages to the capital, because she had walked this road 100 times in her life, in spring mud and autumn frost, and even once in early winter snow that reached her ankles and made her laugh. But this was not that kind of snow. This was the kind of snow that the elders in her village described in whispers after too much winter wine, the kind they called the white silence, the kind that came once in a generation and left a different world behind when it finally released its grip. The wind moved through the pass like something alive and furious, pressing against her with a force that felt personal, felt intentional, felt almost as though the mountain itself had decided that she should not pass. Sarah had wrapped her traveling cloak so tightly around herself that her arms ached from the effort, and still the cold found its way through every seam, every imperfect fold, every place where fabric met skin and lost the argument. Her medical bag hung from her left shoulder, heavy with the tools of her trade, the small glass vials of herbal tinctures, the rolls of clean linen for binding wounds, the bone-handled instruments her father had given her on the day she completed her training, and she had refused to leave it behind even when the rational part of her mind had quietly suggested that dead healers help no one. She had kept walking because stopping meant dying, and she had kept believing she was walking in the right direction because the alternative to that belief was also dying, just differently. And then the snow had reached her knees, and her legs had run out of the particular stubbornness that had carried her this far, and she had stopped. She was not afraid. That surprised her, in the small, quiet corner of her mind that was still functioning clearly enough to notice such things. She had expected fear to be the last emotion standing, the one that clung longest when everything else let go. But what she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion and something closer to sorrow, a deep and genuine regret that she would not make it back to her village, would not sit again in her father's chair by the fire, would not finish the chapter of the botanical compendium she had been studying for 3 weeks, would not deliver the twins she had promised the farmer's wife near the eastern mill would come safely into the world in 2 months' time. She was sorry about the twins most of all. She had made a promise, and she took promises seriously, and dying in a blizzard on the Valdenmoor Passage was a poor excuse for breaking one. And then she heard the horse. It was not the sound she expected. She had expected, if she heard anything at all through the roar of the wind, the distant bells of a village, or perhaps the crack of a tree giving way to the weight of the ice. She had not expected hoofbeats, massive and rhythmic and utterly certain, the sound of an animal that was not afraid of the storm because the storm had not yet met anything it could not defeat, and neither had this horse. She turned toward the sound with a slowness that frightened her, because her body was no longer responding to urgency the way it should, and she saw through the white chaos of the blizzard a shape that resolved itself gradually into the most enormous horse she had ever seen in her life. It was black, so completely and purely black that it seemed to absorb the snow rather than accumulate it, and it moved through the drifts the way a ship moves through rough water, with authority and without apology. On its back sat a figure so still and so upright that for one strange half-frozen moment, Sarah thought she was hallucinating, thought her mind had conjured some mythological figure from the stories her mother used to tell, the winter rider who supposedly came for those who died in the cold and carried them somewhere warmer. But the figure was real, and it pulled the horse to a stop perhaps 10 feet from where she stood, and it looked down at her from that impossible height with an expression she could not read through the fur-lined hood and the driving snow. "You are going to die," the figure said. The voice was low and carried the kind of absolute certainty that comes not from cruelty, but from long practice with facts. "If you stay here." "I am aware," Sarah said, and was somewhat surprised to discover that her voice still worked. even if it came out thinner and rougher than she intended. I was trying to address the situation. The figure was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted its weight, impatient, and the rider controlled it with the smallest possible movement. Of one hand, barely a flex of the wrist, and the horse stilled immediately and completely. By standing still in a blizzard, by resting briefly before continuing. She pulled her cloak tighter. I did not ask for commentary. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Another silence. Longer this time. The wind screamed between them. Then the rider reached down with one gloved hand, a hand she could now. Sea was very large and very certain of itself, and said, "Take my hand. I do not know you." "No," the rider agreed, "and you will never know anyone again if you remain where you are. Take my hand, healer. Your bag tells me what you are. I need what you carry, and you need what I have, which is a horse and a direction, and the likelihood of survival. This is a transaction, not a kindness. Take my hand." She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him with an ease that should not have been possible for a man of any size, much less the ease with which one lifts a child. And she landed behind him on the saddle with a jarring that rattled her teeth, and the sudden overwhelming warmth of him that hit her like walking from a cold room into a kitchen where something has been roasting all day. He was warm the way rocks are warm when they have been in the sun for hours, a deep and stored warmth, a warmth that radiated outward without effort, and she had wrapped her arms around his torso. Before she made the conscious decision to do so, pressing herself against his back with a desperation that she would have been embarrassed about if she had been warmer. He did not comment on this. He turned the horse, and they moved into the storm, and the horse moved through it the way the rider had suggested, with authority and without apology. And Sarah pressed her face against the heavy fur of his cloak, and breathed, and tried to understand what had just happened to her. His name came to her. Slowly, assembled from pieces the way a puzzle assembles from scattered parts. The horse. She had seen that horse before, in illustrated manuscripts that circulated through the educated households of the kingdom, in the official portraiture that hung in the council chambers of every territory governor. Valdenmoor's war horse was famous because there was only one, a lichen-bonded stallion that could be ridden by only one person in the entire kingdom, a horse that had been gifted to the throne by the mountain pack 3 generations ago and had bonded to the current king with a completeness that made scholars of supernatural bonds cite it as one of the purest examples of the phenomenon ever recorded. The horse was called Nightfall. And if this was Nightfall, then the body she was currently clutching for warmth belonged to King Zephyr of Valdenmoor, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, the man who had ended the border wars in 2 years when his 3 predecessors had failed to end them. In 30, the man whose name was spoken in certain circles the way storms are spoken of before they arrive, with respect and with warning, and with the understanding that what is coming cannot be stopped, only survived. She was holding on to the Alpha King of Valdenmoor with both arms and her face buried in his back, and she had told him she did not need his commentary. She decided that this information could wait until she was warmer. The shelter appeared through the snow perhaps 40 minutes. Later, a stone structure built into the side of the mountain itself, one of the old way station houses that the kingdom maintained along the mountain passes for exactly this kind of emergency. Zephyr dismounted first and led Nightfall to the side of the structure where a covered area provided minimal but real protection from the wind, and he settled the horse with practiced efficiency, removing the saddle with movements that spoke of long habit, covering the animal with the thick wool blanket. From the saddlebag, and speaking to it in a low voice that Sarah, still sitting on the ground where she had half fallen when he helped her down, could not quite hear. She used the time to do an inventory of her own condition, working through her body the way her father had taught her, starting at the extremities and moving inward. Her fingers were numb but not frostbitten, which was fortunate. Her feet were in a more concerning state. Her core temperature was low enough that she was shivering in a way that had moved past the useful stage of shivering and into the less useful stage, the stage where the body has started to wonder if it should bother. She needed warmth, and she needed it quickly, and she needed something hot inside her body, and she needed to look at whatever injury the Alpha King had described when he said she had what he needed, because she had not missed the way he had held himself slightly sideways when he dismounted, not the way an unwounded man holds himself, and she had not missed the dark stain at his left side that the black of his clothing mostly concealed, but did not entirely conceal. He came back to her and looked down at her on the ground, with the same unreadable expression she had seen through the blizzard. Up close, without the driving snow between them, she could see his face clearly for the first time, and she filed several observations away with the clinical detachment that her training had given her. He was younger than she had expected. The portraits did not lie about the structure of his face, which was all sharp angles and strong lines, and the kind of bone architecture that painters adored because it gave them something definitive to work with. But the portraits had somehow aged him in her imagination, had made him seem like a man who had been a king since before he was born, which in some ways he had been. In reality, he was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years beyond that, with dark eyes that catalogued her with the same unsentimental efficiency she was using to catalog him, and a mouth that was set in a line that she thought was probably its resting position, and not, as she might have assumed in a lesser man, an expression of displeasure. He was, in the purely technical sense that she applied to such assessments, extraordinarily handsome, which she noted and then set aside as irrelevant to the current situation, which was survival, which was always the current situation until it was not. "Can you walk?" he said. It was not entirely a question. "Yes," she said, and proved it by standing up, which took more effort than she wanted to admit, but which she accomplished without assistance because the alternative was to be carried, and she was not prepared to add that to the list of things that had already happened to her today. He opened the way station door, which was heavy and reinforced and clearly designed to withstand exactly the kind of weather currently occurring outside, and she walked through it. Ahead of him because he held it, and she went. And then she heard it close behind them, and the sound of the blizzard dropped from a roar to a distant howl, and the relative silence was so profound that she stood still for a moment just to feel it. The way station was small but solid. One room, stone walls, a fireplace that took up most of one wall with wood already laid in it, a practical kindness from whoever had last used this place and left it ready for the next desperate traveler. 2 wooden sleeping platforms built into opposite walls, a small table, shelves along one wall with the basics, dried food in sealed containers, oil for the lamp that hung from the ceiling, an extra blanket folded with military precision. Zephyr moved past her to the fireplace, with the particular focused purpose of a man who has decided what needs to happen next and is happening it. And he had the fire lit in a time that impressed her professionally, the quick, efficient movements of someone who had built fires in difficult conditions more times than he could count. The flame caught and grew, and the warmth began to push outward into the room, and Sarah exhaled something she had been holding since the snow reached her knees, something tightly wound and quietly desperate, and she went to the fire and held her hands out to it, and let the heat begin the work of bringing her back. "Sit," Zephyr said. He was at the shelves, moving through the supplies with the same systematic efficiency. "I will stand," she said. "The warmth reaches me better standing. My circulation is compromised." She paused. "You are injured. It is manageable. That is what people say about injuries that are not managed until they become unmanageable." She turned from the fire and looked at him directly. "Show me." He turned to look at her with those dark eyes, and there was something in the look that she could not quite categorize, something that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement but had elements of both. She suspected that people did not generally instruct him to show them things. She held his gaze without difficulty because she had been trained by a man who believed that a healer who could not look at anything clearly was a healer who could not help anyone, and she had practiced looking at difficult things clearly for her entire adult life. And whatever the Alpha King of Valdenmoor was, he was also simply a man with an injury that needed attention. "You are a healer," he said, after a moment. "Yes, and you need one, so show me." He removed his outer cloak, and then, with movements that were slightly too careful on the left side, removed the leather riding coat beneath it, and she saw the wound. It was a knife wound, clean-edged and deep, below his ribs on the left side. The kind of wound that could be managed, or could be catastrophic, depending entirely on what exactly had been hit, and how long ago, and how much had been lost. He had packed it himself with cloth torn from something, which was sensible, and had bought time. But the packing was saturated, and the wound needed proper attention. She was across the room before she finished processing this, her medical bag already open, her hands already moving through its contents with the familiarity of long practice. "Sit down," she said again. "On the platform. I need light, and I need access, and I need you to be lower than you currently are." He sat. She noted this with a small internal acknowledgement that she did not allow to become anything larger. He sat because the situation required it, not because she had told him to. But she was a pragmatist about such distinctions and moved on. She brought the lamp closer and knelt beside him and removed the makeshift packing with careful hands. And she heard the small involuntary sound he made when the cloth pulled at the wound. And she noted that too, and moved on. The wound itself was concerning but not catastrophic. Deep, but the angle had spared the organs that would have made it fatal. She needed to clean it and close it and keep it closed, and she needed to do all of this in a stone room with firelight and her traveling kit, which she had done before in worse circumstances, and would, she suspected, do again. She worked with focused silence, cleaning the wound with the antiseptic tincture that smelled sharp enough to make his jaw tighten, stitching it closed with the small curved needle and the gut thread she always carried, covering it with a clean linen pad. Secured with wrapping that she applied with the tension that experience had taught her was exactly right. She was aware, throughout this process, that he was watching her. Not the wound, her. Not with the watchful suspicion of a man who distrusts strangers touching him, which she had encountered before and learned to work around, but with something else, something quieter and more attentive. She did not address it. She finished the binding and tied it off and sat back on her heels and said, "Do not sleep on that side. Move as little as possible. If it opens during the night, wake me." She paused. "I have a willow bark compound that will address the pain. It will also reduce fever if one develops, which is the greater concern at this point." "I do not need pain management," he said. "That is also something that people say," she replied, already reaching into her bag for the compound. "Right before they accept it." She prepared the dose and held it out to him, and after a moment he took it, which she counted as a small victory in the ongoing negotiation of his cooperation. She stood and returned to the fire and began the next task on her internal list, which was her own feet, which needed attention now that the more urgent situation had been addressed. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. She sat on the edge of the opposite sleeping platform and removed her boots with considerable difficulty and more considerable discomfort, and she was examining the damage with professional detachment when she heard him say, "Your feet. They will be fine," she said. "Early frost nip, not frostbite. The fire will handle most of it." She looked up. "I do not actually know your name." She knew it perfectly well, of course, but she wanted to hear what he would say, wanted to understand how he inhabited his own identity in a situation this stripped of ceremony. He looked at her for a long moment. "Zephyr. Just the name, not the titles, not the formal construction. Just the name, offered the way a person offers something they are not certain will be received." She nodded. "Sarah," she said. "My name is Sarah. I am a healer from Millhaven, which is one of the southern villages below the pass. She paused. I was attempting to return from the Eastern Medical Convocation in Thornfield when the storm caught me. You were walking the passage alone. I was walking with 3 other delegates from the Southern Territories. We became separated in the early hours of the storm. She did not say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that she did not know if they were alive, which was the kind of knowledge she could not do anything about right now, and therefore could not afford to spend energy on. She would grieve it later if it became something to grieve. Right now she had frost-nipped feet, and a patient, and a blizzard, and a king, and that was more than enough. You were calm, he said. When I found you. Most people panic. Panic uses energy, she said. I did not have energy to spare. She flexed her toes experimentally and felt the beginning of the unpleasant pins and needles that meant circulation was returning. How long do you estimate before the storm passes? My wolf senses suggest 12 hours, perhaps 18. He said it the way people say such things in this part of the kingdom, without self-consciousness or apology, because supernatural abilities were simply part of the landscape here, as ordinary as the mountains themselves. Sarah had treated lichen-born patients all her life, and had never found anything remarkable about the practical application of abilities that were simply part of how certain people were built. Then we have time, she said, for you to tell me who stabbed you. The silence that followed had texture. She had learned to read the silences of injured people, which were often more informative than anything they said out loud, and this one had layers. There was the silence of a man deciding how much to say. There was the silence of someone unaccustomed to being asked direct questions without ceremony. And beneath both of those, there was something else, something tighter and older. The silence of someone who has been carrying something alone for long enough that the weight of it has become part of their posture. I was returning from an inspection of the northern border fortifications, he said finally. There were 6 of them, hired men. They knew my route, which means the information came from someone inside the palace or the council. He said all of this with a flatness that was more frightening than anger would have been, because flatness meant it had been processed, had been fitted into a pattern, had been recognized as one piece of something larger. I handled 5. The 6th managed the knife before I could reach him. You fought 6 men, Sarah said. I am an alpha king, he said, and there was no arrogance in it. Only fact, the same. Tone in which he might have said the sky is above us, or the fire is warm. 6 men is not a difficult number. It is a difficult number when one of them has a knife and you are alone, she said. Where was your guard? I dismissed them for the inspection. I prefer to assess the borders without the performance that accompanies a formal escort. He paused. It is a decision I will be reconsidering. That seems wise, she said, without emphasis. And he looked at her again with that expression. She could not quite categorize, and this time she thought she saw something move in his eyes, something that might have been amusement, if it had been given slightly more room. The fire built the room up into warmth over the next hour, warmth that reached into the stone walls and the wooden platforms, and the cold that had settled into Sarah's bones over the hours in the blizzard, and began, gradually, to negotiate a withdrawal. She had eaten some of the dried food from the way station shelves, had made a tea from the water. She heated in the small iron pot she found on the shelf, and her own stores of dried herbs, and had pressed a second cup of it on Zephyr, who had accepted it without the ceremony of refusal, which suggested either that the willow bark had made him more amenable or that he was, beneath the titles and the reputation, a practical man. She found herself thinking he was both. They talked, not continuously, not without pauses, but with the particular rhythm that descends on 2 people who have no other company and no immediate escape from each other, and have both made a tacit decision to make the best of it. She learned that he had been king for 8 years, ascending after his father's death from a fever that had come on quickly and resolved badly, and that those 8 years had contained the border wars and the famine of the Western reaches, and a political crisis involving 3 of his council members that he described in precise, uncolored terms that somehow made it sound more alarming than passionate description would have. He had ended all of these things. She asked how, more than once, and the answers were always the same in structure. He had identified the actual problem, which was usually not the problem that people believed it to be, and then he had addressed the actual problem, which was usually more difficult than addressing the apparent one. She found this approach deeply familiar because it was the approach of medicine, the thing her father had spent 20 years teaching her, and she said so. He looked at her when she said that. "Your father," he said. "He trained you. He is the healer of Millhaven," she said. "Has been for 35 years. He is the reason I became a healer and the reason I am a good one." She said this without false modesty, because she was, in fact, a good healer, and she had been taught that false modesty about professional competence was a form of dishonesty that her patients could not afford. "His name is Aldrich of Millhaven." Something changed in Zephyr's face. It was subtle, the way things change in the faces of people who have learned to keep their faces under control. But she had trained herself to notice subtle things, and she noticed this. A shift behind the eyes. A stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. "Aldrich," he said. "You know the name," she said. It was not a question. "I know of a man named Aldrich," he said slowly. "But the Aldrich I know of was not a village healer. He was something else entirely." The wind screamed outside the stone walls. The fire crackled and shifted. Sarah felt something move through her that was not cold, that was not warmth, that was something in between, something that felt like the moment before understanding arrives, when you can feel the shape of it, but cannot yet see it clearly. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him making a decision, could almost watch the architecture of it, the way he assessed what to say, and how much, and to what end. And then he said, "The guardians of the ancient blood were a lineage of healers, not simply healers in the way that word is usually used, but healers in the old sense, before the word was narrowed to mean only those who treat wounds and illness. In the old language, the word covered something broader. It meant those who maintain balance, between the human and the supernatural, between what is and what should be." He paused. They had wolf blood, not the dominant strain, not the kind that manifests in transformation, but the quieter kind, the kind that expresses itself differently, as the ability to sense what is wrong in a body, in a spirit, in a kingdom, as the ability to find the actual problem beneath the apparent one. He looked at her steadily. The last recorded member of the Guardians disappeared from the kingdom's records approximately 30 years ago. The records were removed. I found the originals in the deep archives 3 years ago and have been trying to understand why they were removed and by whom. The silence between them was different now. Sarah was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not usually aware of it, the steady rhythm of it, the particular pace that meant her body was paying attention to something important. "My father arrived in Millhaven 30 years ago," she said slowly, "with nothing, no history he was willing to discuss, no connections to any previous life. He told me once, when I was very young and asked where we came from, that we came from exactly where we were, which I understood to mean the question was not to be asked again." She paused. "I have a metal hone. My father gave it to me the morning I left for the convocation in Thornfield. He said to keep it with me always, and never to show it to anyone, but to trust my instincts about when the time for secrecy had passed." She reached into the inner pocket of her traveling cloak, which she had not removed, because she was still cold enough to want the layers, and found the metal hone where it always was, smooth and warm from proximity to her body, and she held it in her palm and looked at it. She had looked at it 1,000 times and noticed the design, the intricate knotwork that surrounded a central image of a wolf in mid-transformation. One paw raised, head turned as if listening. She had thought it was simply old and beautiful. She had not thought to read it as what it apparently was, which was a declaration. She held it out to Zephyr. He took it from her hand and looked at it, and she watched his face do the thing it had done when she said her father's name, the subtle shift, the different stillness. "This is a guardian seal," he said. "I have seen the description of it in the archives. I have never seen the physical object." He turned it over. On the back, which she had always assumed was blank, there was writing she could not read, fine and worn, and in an alphabet she did not recognize. "It says," he said, reading it the way someone reads something in a language they know, but encounter rarely, with the slight pause between words of someone translating as they go. The blood remembers what the mind is made to forget. Sarah felt something move through her that was entirely physical, a wave of sensation from her feet to the crown of her head. Warmth and electricity combined, the feeling she had learned over years to associate with her instincts when they were telling. Her something was deeply important. She had always been exceptional at finding what was wrong. She had always been able to sense the imbalance in a patient before she could see the clinical evidence of it. She had always, when she walked into a room where something terrible had happened, felt it before anyone told her. She had believed, because she had been raised in a world that offered her no other framework, that these were the skills of an attentive and well-trained healer. She had not considered that they might be something else, something older. "The storm was not natural," Zephyr said. He was looking at her with an expression she could finally name, because it was an expression she recognized from her own mirror, the expression of someone who has been piecing together a puzzle for a long time and has just received the piece that makes the image legible. "I suspected it before I left the border fortifications. The meteorological conditions were wrong for a storm of this magnitude. Too sudden, too precisely placed. Someone with significant supernatural ability helped this storm arrive." He paused. "Someone who wanted the passage impassable. Someone who wanted you trapped," she said. "Someone who wanted us both trapped," he said. "Or someone who wanted you to never reach the capital." He said it quietly, but the weight of it was not quiet at all. The convocation in Thornfield. Was it scheduled? Public knowledge? "It was in the territorial records," she said, slowly. "Anyone with access to the council registers could have known I was attending." She thought of the 3 other delegates she had become separated from and felt sick. "The ambush on you. The storm. They are connected." "They are connected," he agreed. "And whoever orchestrated them knew enough to target both of us. Which means they know what you are, even if you do not." He looked at the metal Han in his hand, and then held it back to her. "Your blood is what activates the Guardian. Abilities fully. They are latent until a moment of need calls them forward. The cold. The extremity of tonight. That is the kind of crucible that historically preceded a Guardian awakening." She took the metal Han back and held it, and thought about her feet, which had stopped being numb and were now warm, which was expected. She thought about the way the warmth in the room had built faster than the fire alone could explain. She thought about the quality of her awareness of Zephyr's injury from the moment she first touched him. Not just the physical damage, but something beneath it, an understanding of him that went beyond the clinical, an awareness of his vitality and his pain, and something else, something that did not have a medical name, something that she had felt in the fingertips of both hands, like a language she was reading for the first time, and understanding perfectly. She thought about the metal Han, warm against her palm. She thought about her father, who had arrived in Millhaven 30 years ago with no history, and a daughter, and a name, and a gift for healing, and who had given her the metal Han the morning she left as if he had known, as if some part of him had understood that this was the day the secrecy would end. "Tell me what you know about the Guardians," she said. All of it, he told her. It took a long time, and the fire burned down and she built it back up again, and outside the blizzard raged with the indifference of enormous things to the small. Dramas of human lives. And inside the way station the warmth held steady, and the story unfolded. The Guardians had been part of the kingdom for as long as the kingdom had existed. Longer, perhaps. Going back to the founding packs and the first alphas who understood that power without wisdom was just destruction at a slower pace. They were neither fully human nor fully Lycan, but something the old scholars had called the third kind. The mediators, those whose blood carried both strains in a particular balance that expressed itself as clarity rather than transformation. They had served as advisors, as healers, as the keepers of certain knowledge that the alpha hierarchy found uncomfortable to hold, but necessary to preserve. And then, 30 years ago, something had shifted in the political landscape of the kingdom. A faction within the High Council that believed the Guardians represented a threat to the consolidation of alpha authority, a check on power that certain powerful men found inconvenient. They had moved against the Guardians systematically. Most had simply disappeared. Some had survived by becoming invisible, like a healer in a small village who arrived with no history and asked no questions about his past, and raised his daughter to find the actual problem beneath the apparent one. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Lady Isolde, Sarah said, when he described the faction and its current membership. Because she had been listening the way her father had taught her to listen, not just to the words, but to the shape of the information, the place where things connected. You said her family name. Crestwood, Zephyr said. She is betrothed to me by a political agreement that was made 8 years ago, during the border wars, when I needed the Crestwood military support, and the price was the betrothal. She is not a woman I chose, and the Crestwood family was part of the original faction that moved against the Guardians. The pause was brief but definitive. Yes, he said, and she is in the capital right now. Aware that you went to the border, aware presumably of your route. Sarah was thinking clinically, the same process she used when a patient presented with symptoms that did not immediately cohere but which, when arranged correctly, told a story. The storm is not just to trap us or eliminate us. It is also to create a window. While you are unreachable, while the passage is closed, things can be arranged, decisions can be made, facts can be established that will be very difficult to unmake once you return. She looked at him. She has had your disappearance to work with for however long the storm has been building. What can she do with it? He was quiet, and the quality of his quiet told her she had identified something real. There are emergency succession protocols, he said finally. If the Alpha King cannot be reached for more than 48 hours during a crisis of the kingdom, the High Council has the authority to convene in his absence and make certain decisions on behalf of the throne. Limited decisions. But in the right hands, a limited decision can be the foundation for a much larger one. He paused. Isolde's father sits on the High Council, has since before I was king. Then we need to move as soon as the storm allows, Sarah said. She was already thinking through the logistics, the horse, her medical supplies, his wound, and how much stress it could tolerate in the next 18 hours. The roads that would be passable in the immediate aftermath of the blizzard, and the roads that would not be. I need to tell you something about your wound. It is healing already, he said, and she heard something careful in his voice. Something that was neither boast nor complaint, but something else. She looked at him. Show me. He unwound the binding with hands that moved with more ease than they had an hour ago, and she leaned forward to look. And the wound that she had stitched an hour ago with a needle and gut thread and covered with a linen pad was approximately 60% closed. Not in the way a wound closes over days, the gradual work of the body's systems doing what they are built to do, but in the rapid, visible way that Lycan healing worked, accelerated and almost aggressive in its efficiency. She had seen Lycan healing before. This was not quite that. This was faster, and the skin around the wound, rather than the normal redness of repair, had the faint luminescence at the edges that she had read about in her father's oldest books. The books that she had assumed were theoretical, symbolic, metaphorical, all the ways that people describe things they believe are not literally true. "I am healing you," she said slowly. "My proximity is accelerating your healing." "Yes," he said. "I suspected. I have felt it since you first touched me." She sat back and thought about this with the calm that she had developed. For moments when clinical reality presented itself in forms that the existing framework could not comfortably accommodate. The guardian ability, the old scholars had apparently written, expressed itself as balance, as the capacity to restore what had been disrupted. In the presence of injury, the blood remembered what healing meant at a level more fundamental than medicine. She thought about her hands, and all the patients who had healed faster than she expected. She thought about her father and the cases in Millhaven that people called miraculous, the ones where recovery defied what the textbooks predicted. She thought about the metal hone, warm in her pocket, and the writing on the back. The blood remembers what the mind is made to forget. "I need to ask you something," she said. She was looking at the fire, not at him, because what she needed to ask required a certain distance to say clearly. The mate bond, between an alpha king and a true mate. What does it feel like? The silence was long and had an entirely different quality from his previous silences. She heard him breathe in, heard him release it slowly, heard him shift on the platform in a way that sounded like someone moving to face something directly. "It feels," he said finally, "like finding the actual problem beneath the apparent one." She turned to look at him then, because she had to. He was looking at her with the open honesty of someone who has run out of reasons to be careful, and she thought that this was probably the rarest thing in the world, an alpha king without his defenses. In a stone room in a blizzard with a healer who had just realized that every warmth she had felt since his hand closed on hers in the snow was not the warmth of survival or the warmth of fire, but something older and more exact. She had not asked the question because she did not know the answer. She had asked it because she needed to hear him say it. "I have felt it," she said, "since you pulled me up." "Yes," he said. "This complicates everything." "Yes," he said again. "Everything." She thought about Lady Isolde, sophisticated and calculated, and already in the capital with her father on the High Council, and 18 hours of a king's absence to work with. She thought about the faction that had dismantled the Guardians 30 years ago, that had tried again tonight with a knife in a blizzard, that wanted her dead, and Zephyr either dead or bound to a political alliance that would give them the access to power. They had been building toward for 30 years. She thought about her father in Millhaven, who had given her the metal hone the morning she left as if he had known, and she thought about what it cost a man to disappear so completely that his own daughter did not know what she was, to choose that cost deliberately for 30 years. And she felt something in her chest that was both grief and understanding in equal measure. "I am not going to pretend that what I feel is not what it is," she said. "But I am also not going to allow it to be a weakness. Whoever orchestrated tonight understood exactly what they were doing. The mate bond, if it is known, if it is visible, becomes leverage. It becomes a way to control you through me, and me through you." She looked at him steadily. "I will not be leverage." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "No, you will not." And the way he said it was not reassurance, not performance, not the rote promise of a man trying to placate a woman. It was a decision made in real time, in a stone room in a blizzard, with the same quality of certainty he had used when he said 6 men is not a difficult number. It was the voice of someone who has identified the actual problem and is addressing it. "Tell me about the council," she said. "Tell me who is genuinely loyal and who is performing loyalty. Tell me what the emergency succession protocols actually allow and what they cannot be stretched to cover. Tell me about Isolde's father and what he wants and what he is afraid of." She leaned forward slightly. "We have 12 hours. Let us use them." They talked through the night. The storm raged outside the stone walls with all the enthusiasm of something that has been given a purpose. And inside the way station the fire burned, and the Alpha King of Valdenmoor told a healer from a small village everything she needed to know about the machinery of the kingdom she had been living in without understanding all her life. She asked questions that made him look at her differently each time, not with surprise exactly, because she thought he was not a man who was easily surprised, but with the kind of accumulating recognition that builds toward something. She told him about the medical convocation, about what she had learned there, about the patterns she had noticed in the health of the Eastern territories that spoke to her of something systemic, something environmental, something that correlated with certain industrial practices that the Eastern lords had been expanding for 3 years. He listened to her the way she listened to her father, the way someone listens when they have understood that the person speaking knows something they need to know. She found that she was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire, a warmth that went from her center outward, the particular warmth of being genuinely heard, which she had not realized she had been hungry for until it was given. At some point in the very early hours, the quality of the silence outside the way station changed. The howling dropped half a register, and then dropped again, and then fell into something that was simply wind, strong but finite, the wind of aftermath rather than the wind of event. The blizzard was ending. Zephyr rose and opened the way station door, and stood in the frame of it looking outward, and Sarah came to stand beside him and look at what the storm had left. The world was white and absolute. Every edge softened, every familiar landmark buried or transformed, and the sky was beginning, at the very far eastern edge, to show the particular blue-gray of pre-dawn, the color that means the darkness is not permanent. 4 hours, he said. Nightfall can move through this. We will be at the palace before the council convenes. She was looking at the sky, at the color of coming dawn, thinking about what would happen when they arrived, and what she would need to do, and what she was, now, in the full sense of that word, what it meant, and what it required. "Your wound," she said, "is nearly closed," he said. He looked down at her, and this close, in the quiet that the ending storm had given them, she could see his face as clearly as she had seen anyone's, the bone structure, and the dark eyes, and the set of his mouth that was not displeasure, and never had been. And she thought that the painters who had made the official portraits had captured the exterior perfectly, and the interior not at all, because the interior was a man who had been managing an enormous responsibility alone for 8 years, and who had, in a stone room in a blizzard, stopped managing it alone, and who looked at her now with something in his face that was entirely without management. "When we arrive," she said carefully, "we will be arriving together. That will communicate something." "Yes," he said. "Are you prepared for what it communicates?" "I have been prepared for it," he said, "since approximately the moment you told me you did not need my commentary." And there was something in his voice that she recognized as the thing he did not usually allow, the thing beneath the management and the titles and the 8 years of responsibility carried alone, the thing that was simply him. And it was, she thought, exactly what she would have expected if she had expected anything at all. She went back inside to prepare for travel, to check his wound one final time, and verify that her medical bag was secure, and that she had everything she had arrived with plus the understanding she had gained. And he went to prepare nightfall. And when she stepped out of the way station with her bag over her shoulder, and her traveling cloak wrapped against the cold that was still significant but survivable, the horse was ready, and he was standing beside it waiting for her. And he held out his hand the same way he had held it out in the worst of the blizzard, with the same certainty, the same quality of someone who has made a decision and is standing behind it. She took his hand. He lifted her up behind him and she settled there the way she had in the blizzard, with her arms around him and her face turned forward now rather than buried in his back, so that she could see where they were going, which was east and toward the city, and toward everything that waited there. Nightfall moved out of the shelter of the covered area and into the transformed world, and the sound of hooves in deep snow was a different sound than hooves on a clear road, muffled and steady and patient, the sound of an animal that is built for exactly this. And Sarah looked at the sky where the dawn color was growing and thought about her father and the metal hawn in her pocket and the blood that remembered what the mind had been made to forget. She thought about what she now knew herself to be. Not a village healer, not a girl who had accidentally acquired exceptional instincts, not a woman who had simply gotten good at finding the actual problem beneath the apparent one. She was all of those things, and she would always be all of those things, because those were the things her father had given her, and they were true and real, and entirely hers. But she was also the last guardian, the surviving member of a lineage that had served this kingdom since before the current system existed, and she carried in her blood the capacity to perceive what was wrong in a body, in a spirit, in a kingdom, and to participate in its correction. She had been doing this her whole life. She had simply not had the language for it. Now she did. They rode in silence for a long time, the good kind of silence, the kind that does not need filling, the kind that has room in it for thought and for feeling and for the particular attentiveness of two people who are aware of each other without needing to perform it. The dawn built itself slowly across the sky, moving from the blue-gray of pre-dawn through the rose and gold of early morning, light that hit the snow and fragmented into something extraordinary. And Sarah looked at the transformed world and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was hope. Not the small, cautious hope of a person who has learned to expect difficulty, but the larger and more reckless kind, the kind that comes from knowing what you are and believing it is enough. The capital appeared on the horizon in the late morning, the towers and walls of Valdenmoor's great city, catching the winter light and throwing it back, and Sarah straightened her spine and settled her medical bag and felt the warmth of the mate bond in her chest like a fire that had been built to last. She was not afraid. That still surprised her, a little. But she was learning to trust the things that surprised her, to pay attention to them, to understand that her instincts had always been telling her the truth, and that the only thing that had ever needed catching up was her willingness to listen. "There will be people at the gate," Zephyr said. "When we arrive, there will be people at the gate." "I know," she said. "They will see us arrive together, on nightfall. There is only one interpretation." "I know," she said again. "Is that a warning or a question?" A brief pause. "A question." "Then my answer is the same as yours was," she said. "I have been prepared for it since approximately the moment you told me this was a transaction, and not a kindness." She paused deliberately. "It was a kindness. You simply did not want to call it that." She heard something happen in him, that she felt through her hands against his sides. A small seismic thing, a release of something that had been held for a very long time. And then he laughed, quietly and genuinely. The laugh of a man who has not laughed in a while and who has been surprised into it, and the sound of it moved through the cold morning air and dissolved into the light and the snow, and Nightfall's ears pricked forward as if the horse approved, which she thought it probably did. The gates of Valdenmoor opened as they approached, because the gates of Valdenmoor always opened for nightfall, and they rode through at a pace that was neither urgent nor casual, but something in between, the pace of people who have somewhere important to be, and who intend to get there without performing the importance. There were guards, and there were people, and there were faces turning toward them, with expressions she catalogued automatically. Surprise, recognition, confusion working. Toward conclusion. She sat straight and looked forward, and kept her hands steady at Zephyr's sides, and breathed evenly, because she had stood in rooms where terrible things had happened, and had learned that the most powerful thing a person could do in such moments was remain themselves, fully and without apology. The palace courtyard was not empty. Of course it was not. Lady Isolde was in the courtyard. She was exactly what the descriptions had suggested, which was to say she was extraordinary. In the way that certain manufactured things are extraordinary, polished to a perfection that left nothing to chance or to nature, dark hair dressed with the kind of care that looks effortless, because the effort has been made invisibly. She stood at the center of the courtyard with 2 of her ladies and 3 council members, and her expression when she saw them arrive was a masterwork of controlled composure doing very specific work, the kind of expression that is designed to suggest concern, where it feels triumph, and to suggest warmth where it feels nothing. Sarah noted all of this in the time it took nightfall to cross half the courtyard, and she filed it away for use. Zephyr dismounted and helped Sarah down with the simplicity of someone for whom this action is already natural, already claimed. And she stood beside him in the courtyard with her medical bag over her shoulder, and her traveling cloak still carrying the dried snow of the pass. And she looked at Lady Isolde with the clarity she had developed for difficult things, and found the diagnosis immediate and complete. "My lord," Isolde said, and her voice was pitched exactly right, warm and relieved and properly subordinate. A beautiful performance. "We have been so worried. The storm, the reports of the conditions in the passage." Her eyes moved to Sarah, with the precise brevity of someone who has learned to weaponize the amount of attention they direct at a target, conveying in a fraction of a second the full taxonomy of dismissal. "You found a survivor." "I found a guardian," Zephyr said. He said it simply, the way he said most important things, without decoration or announcement, just the fact placed where it needed to be. The last of the guardian lineage of Valdenmoor, daughter of Aldrich, who served this kingdom for 35 years in Millhaven, after your father's faction removed the guardians from the official records 30 years ago. He looked at Lord Crestwood, who was standing slightly behind Isolde, and whose face was doing something complicated and involuntary. "I will be reviewing those records, and the emergency succession protocols that were apparently being prepared during my absence, and the weather events that have been reported in the high mountain passes in the last week, which I suspect bear investigation by someone with expertise in supernatural meteorological intervention." The courtyard was very quiet, not the white silence of the blizzard, which was enormous and indifferent, but the small and specific silence of people who are trying to calculate quickly and finding the numbers moving faster than they can follow. Sarah watched Lord Crestwood's face do its complicated thing, and watched Isolde's composure hold by sheer force of will, and watched the 3 council members who were not Crestwood reassessing everything they had understood about this morning. Then she stepped forward, just slightly, just enough to be beside Zephyr rather than behind him, and she addressed the courtyard in the voice she used when she was in a room where terrible things had happened, and the most important thing was to remain herself, fully and without apology. "The Alpha King sustained an injury in the passage that has been treated and is healing well," she said. "He will need rest and monitoring today. I will be overseeing his recovery as the treating healer." She looked at Lord Crestwood with the clarity she had developed for difficult things. "I will also be available to the council, when the time is right, to provide testimony regarding the events of last night and my professional assessment of the conditions that produced them. I understand there are questions. I have a great many of my own." She paused. "I was trained to find the actual problem beneath the apparent one. It is something of a family tradition. I look forward to the opportunity to practice it here." She heard, from somewhere to her left, a sound that might have been a council member's sharp intake of breath. She did not look. She kept her eyes on what was in front of her. Lord Crestwood had gone very still in the way that guilty things go still when they understand that something has shifted and they do not yet know how to move in the new landscape. Isolde's composure had held, which Sarah had expected, because a woman who had maintained that kind of composure for this long did not crack at the first application of pressure. And Sarah did not need her to crack. She only needed her to understand that the game had changed, and that the pieces on the board were not arranged the way she had believed they were when the dawn broke. Understanding would come. Understanding always came, eventually, when the actual problem was properly identified and addressed. Zephyr touched her arm, barely, just a brush of fingers against the heavy wool of her traveling cloak, and she felt it all the way through the layers and through the cold she was still carrying, and through the warmth of the mate bond that had not stopped being warm since it began, and she understood that he was telling her what she already knew, that they had done what they came to do, that the rest would unfold from here, that the morning was still morning, and the light was still growing, and there was more work ahead, but they were here. They had arrived. The storm had not managed to prevent it. The council members began to disperse with the quick, purposeful movement of people who have understood that a situation has redefined itself, and who have somewhere to be in consequence. Lord Crestwood left the courtyard at a pace that was not quite a retreat, but was definitely not a confident departure. Isolde remained a moment longer than the others, and she looked at Sarah with an expression that had dropped the performance and become simply itself, something precise and assessing, the look of a woman who is reevaluating and who is, beneath the calculation, actually intelligent enough to know what she is looking at. Sarah held the look without aggression or warmth, just with the clarity she had developed for difficult things, and after a moment, Isolde inclined her head, a very small gesture, the minimum acknowledgement of a reality one does not prefer, and then she turned and walked away. "She will not give up," Zephyr said quietly. "No," Sarah agreed. "But she is also not stupid, and stupid is the only thing that would lead someone to keep pushing when the ground has shifted this much. She paused. "She will regroup. There will be more to address. But not today." "Not today," he agreed. The courtyard was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a morning that has decided what it is and is settling into it. A groom came and took Nightfall with the reverence appropriate to a legendary animal, and the horse went calmly, having done the work it came to do. Sarah looked at the palace around her, the towers and the stone and the banners with the Valdenmoor crest, and thought that she had never expected to be standing here, had not had the framework for imagining it as a destination until approximately 18 hours ago, and that the capacity of a single night to rewrite the architecture of a life was something she would be thinking about for a long time. "Your father," Zephyr said. "He should be brought to the capital. He would be safer here, and the kingdom needs what he knows." "He will argue about it," she said. "I expect so. He is very attached to Millhaven. He has, been there for 30 years. He has patients." She paused. "He also has 2 pregnant patients in the Eastern District whose cases I need to transfer documentation for, because I made promises and I take promises seriously." "I know," he said, and she realized from the tone that he meant something larger than the specific statement, that he had been listening all night and understood what she was telling him, which was what she was. The whole of it. The healer and the guardian and the woman who took promises seriously, and who would not be leverage, and who found the actual problem beneath the apparent one, and who had told an Alpha King she did not need his commentary while standing half-frozen in a blizzard, and who intended to remain exactly this person, in a palace or anywhere else, regardless of what the metal hone and the blood and the mate bond and the mourning were suggesting her life had become. "Come inside," he said. "You are still cold, and I need to introduce you to the rest of the council before the day gets away from us. Your wound needs checking first," she said. "You checked it an hour ago, and I will check it again, because I am the treating healer, and that is what treating healers do, and because you rode hard for 3 hours on a wound that was still consolidating, and because I take my professional responsibilities seriously." She gave him a look that she suspected communicated everything she intended. "You will sit still and let me look at it." The thing that happened in his face was the same thing that had happened when she said she did not need his commentary, and she recognized it now for what it was. which was the face of a man who had been managing everything alone for a very long time, encountering someone who intended to be genuinely useful, and who was not, in any register, asking for permission. It was the face of relief, is what it was. Dressed up in other things, but at its core, relief. "Yes, healer," he said. She walked toward the palace doors and he walked beside her, not behind and not ahead. Beside. And the morning light hit the snow on the courtyard stones, and the sound of the city waking up came over the walls. Ordinary and necessary. And Sarah thought about her father, who had kept her safe by making her invisible, and who had given her the medalhon the morning she left, because he had known or hoped or trusted that the time for invisibility was ending. She thought about Millhaven and the farmer's wife, and the twins who were coming and who she had promised would come safely, and she thought about how she would keep that promise from the capital, and what it would mean to rebuild something that had been deliberately dismantled 30 years ago, to find the people who were left and bring them forward, to take the actual problem of a kingdom that had been denied its balance for a generation, and begin to address it in the way she had been trained and born to address things, with clarity and with patience and with the understanding that the blood remembered what the mind had been made to forget. She felt the mate bond in her chest, warm and exact and without apology. She felt the medalhon in her pocket. She felt the morning on her face. She had not panicked in the blizzard because panic uses energy, and she had not had energy to spare. She had not panicked now, in the palace courtyard, in the aftermath of everything, because she was warm enough to know that the energy she had was exactly right for what came next, and what came next was the work, the real work, the work she had been building toward her whole life without the language for it, and she was ready. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? The doors of the palace of Valdenmoor opened before them, and Sarah of Millhaven, last guardian of the ancient blood, walked through them beside the Alpha King, with her medical bag over her shoulder and snow still in her hair, ready to find every actual problem beneath every apparent one, ready to address them one by one, ready to be exactly what she was and had always been and was only now learning to name.